Okay, so then I think we can slowly get started. Can everybody hear me okay? Okay, good. So welcome back. Good morning. As we start into our second lecture of the semester, I'm just going to start this out with a very brief review of some of the main points that we had last week. So just to refresh your memories, we saw basically two main things. We talked a little bit about how to identify an argument, what sets an argument apart from a series of statements that are not arguments. So the main point being here that an argument consists of a claim, the conclusion, along with one or more reasons for thinking that the conclusion is true. So what we call the premises. So an argument tries to justify a conclusion. And we also saw something else. So this is something that we had discussed as well in the tutorials. And this was that only certain kinds of statements can function as premises or conclusions in the context of an argument, namely such statements as are capable of being true or false. So such statements as have truth conditions, as opposed, for instance, to questions or commands or wishes, which have fulfillment conditions. So something that can, even though we might not know whether it is true or false, it can be true or false. And we also saw, and this was kind of a first way of introducing a bit of technical some technical terms, a bit of technical vocabulary, that what is a premise and a conclusion depends on the overall function that a statement is going to fulfill in the context of an argument. So speaking of a premise independently of an argument or in something that is not an argument does not, strictly speaking, make sense. So that was just kind of the way we had agreed, or rather I had assumed we agreed. I told you that we would use the terms from now on. We also saw that that wasn't really the interesting question. So the question, or the reason why most of you are really here, is not to decide whether or not something is an argument, but whether or not something is a good argument. So today's lecture is going to begin looking at this more interesting and also more complicated in many ways question. So what really makes an argument a good argument? Which different ways are there, not just of identifying, but of evaluating arguments? And we're also going to learn a few more technical terms. So a few more terms for saying what makes the goodness, or what determines the goodness of an argument, what kind different terms of goodness or success exist, and so on and so forth. So we'll look at different criteria for evaluating arguments, two main factors being truth and support, and I'll talk a little bit about that then later on, and then we'll also look at different types of support. So we'll find that throughout the semester, much of our attention will be focused not so much on the truth of premises or of a conclusion, not because that's not what we're interested in, but just because that's something that can be a bit trickier to determine just by looking at the argument. So we'll be looking in more detail at how a conclusion would be supported if the premises were true. Okay, so to start out with that, and as I said, there's going to be a bit of technical a couple of technical terms that I'm going to introduce you to at the beginning, and then we'll have some examples and also some quiz questions later on. So a first way of saying that an argument is a good argument, and this is just still using fairly everyday language, is to say that it's successful. And an argument is going to be successful if it actually succeeds in providing good reasons, and not just any reasons, for accepting the conclusion. So this is fairly trivial. I think it's fairly obvious. But now it gets more interesting. So what determines success, or what determines an argument's goodness? Well, one of the crucial factors, and again, this will be something that breaks apart into different sub-factors or further factors, is going to be whether the argument is sound or cogent. So a sound argument is going to be one where we can say that the premises are not only true, but they also support the conclusion. So a sound argument, and this is just the way we're going to use this term, is going to have these two factors, truth and support. And there are going to be many, I'm going to go into many more details, so this is just, we're going to be repeating this a lot. So right on its face, if that's what we're saying, what a sound argument and potentially a good or successful argument is going to be, at the very beginning we can see that we can ask different types of questions in order to decide whether an argument is in fact sound or not. So we can ask about the truth of the premises and the conclusions. This is not surprising. We already talked about this. It's fairly intuitive. And we can ask whether the premises actually support the conclusion. And now all of these types of questions that I have here, and these are just standard questions, like the very first thing that you can think about when you're evaluating an argument. All of these ways of evaluating, criticizing in the sense of assessing, not destructively criticizing, but evaluating, an argument concern the internal structure of the argument, by which I only mean that they concern statements or connections between statements, between premises and the conclusion that are already there in the argument. They don't concern anything that lies outside of the argument. And this internal structure, more or less, will help determine whether the argument is sound in our special technical sense. So given that that is the case, just a very quick question, because I want to just kind of make a map of the technical terms that we're using here. Can you think of any ways in which you can criticize an argument that are external to the argument itself? So there might be factors of success of an argument that aren't reducible to these three questions here. So to the truth of the premises and the conclusion, and the question of whether the premises support the conclusion. So what else might be relevant for determining the goodness or success of an argument as an external factor? Yeah.
Spirit of the time. Like say in the context of people who are having the argument justice claim might have a different impact on people that they are presenting the argument to if social values are different.
So spirit of the time, context, zeitgeist. So that could be not just a factor of time, of history. Is the world flat or not? Cultural discipline. So where are we having the discussion, in a philosophy seminar or not? Yeah. Credibility of the arguer. So, well, this is a tricky one. So do we have, are those reactions to that? Yeah.
I was just wondering, are we talking about good arguments as like what we put on a pedestal as a rationally sound argument, or are we talking about successful arguments and then get into stuff like appealing to people's emotions and that sort of thing?
Mm-hmm. Exactly. Exactly. So those are different things. So when we talk about, so that's why I'm introducing the technical terms. So when we kind of talk about generally a successful argument or a good argument, those are everyday terms that we might use, and all kinds of different things will be mixed up into that. So one aspect of that, just going to jump to the next slide because we've more or less already said that, is going to be, as we already said, context. It's going to be the question, does the argument that we have here really make a relevant contribution to the discussion, or just does it just kind of go off on a tangent? It might still be a good argument, but we might not really care because we care about something else. Is it psychologically convincing? Does it do its work? Obviously, there's one sense in which a good argument is going to convince its audience. And, you know, if you're a notorious liar, like you said, you know, that type of example, the person bringing forth the argument, then that might damage the success, the effect that an argument is, in fact, going to have. There can be a number of other reasons. It might not be presented very elegantly, and so on and so forth, that might reduce its ability to be convincing. So that's exactly why I would say we should say an argument can be successful for many reasons that don't only depend on the argument itself, but these reasons are going to be independent, or these factors are going to be independent of the argument's soundness. So this is exactly why it's kind of helpful in this question, what is a good argument, to immediately introduce this more technical term of soundness that really just looks at the internal factors. So in an ideal world, we would all be convinced by arguments that are sound, so arguments that actually support their conclusions and where the premises are true. In an ideal world, that would be the case. In an ideal world, it wouldn't matter who is actually bringing forth an argument. I mean, a notorious liar can still be, presenting a very good argument, or vice versa. So you might have prejudice and so on and so forth. So this is kind of why we're focusing on soundness in a more technical sense, because that's something that we can actually use some philosophically standard methods to evaluate. Does that answer the worry? Yeah?
Can the soundness of an argument itself impact the efficacy? Like, if you're arguing with very good points to someone who fervently disbelieves what you're arguing, they can become more likely, I guess they'll become more and more fervent as you go, stubborn. Does that make sense?
What do you say?
I was thinking in context of politicians speaking to us, which is very current at the moment, and how disbelieving and dismissive we are of whatever they say, even when there is truth and it's sound.
So again, ideally, what we want to strive to do in looking at arguments is bringing those different factors together. So having a case where a sound argument is going to be convincing. We're going to see cases where those two things can come apart. And that's exactly why these philosophical methods, or methods from philosophy about evaluating arguments, can be helpful. So exactly because they help us prevent those biases. So ideally they should be. There's a normative point there. We would say that a sound argument should be convincing, but in fact it's not always going to be, and that's going to be an empirical question. So what we can say then, we have soundness, and we'll look at the relationship between soundness and validity in a second, but here's another technical term that we're going to introduce. When we're only asking about the support aspect of an argument, so when we're only asking whether the premises of an argument support the conclusion, basically in this case we would be only assuming that if the premises are all true, then and only then they would provide a good reason for thinking that the conclusion is also true. And if we were to say this, so to only focus on this conditional sense, only on the support that true premises would give to the conclusion, then we would say that the argument is valid. And again, there can be different ways in which this is the case, but for now it's just important that you have this technical term. You will also sometimes see people saying in this case that the conclusion follows from, logically follows from the premises, or that it is entailed, and so on and so forth. So those would be a few technical terms to look out for. Now let's look at the relationship between those two things. So we have on the one hand a technical term that describes only this aspect of support in the conditional sense, and we have the aspect that we're also typically even more interested in and sometimes misled by, namely the truth aspect. The premises are indeed true. And both of these ingredients are going to be relevant for soundness. So only an argument that satisfies both, that is both valid and has true premises, is going to be sound. So only that kind of argument is really one of which we should say that we should accept the conclusion. So that's one first way of kind of mapping the relationship between these different technical terms. And the important thing to see, and we'll have some examples about that in a second, and this is where it becomes a little bit tricky, is that truth and validity are independent conditions. An argument can satisfy one of these, but not the other. Both are crucial for an argument's success, both are crucial for soundness, but they can come apart. So here are some ways in which this relationship can be construed, so to make this a bit more practical. So this was a lot of technical lingo, but now we're going to have some examples. So whoever the murderer is, they must be left-handed. A murder has been committed. We have a blood spatter expert like Dexter or something like that, looking at the way the weapon must have been wielded. It must have been somebody who is left-handed. And we have a suspect, Miss Green. Looks pretty suspicious, but she is not left-handed, so she cannot be the murderer. And kind of the figure is going to kind of illustrate why she can't. The murder falls within the group of left-handed people. Miss Green doesn't, so she is not the murderer. So if the premises are all true, and let's say that they are, they support the conclusion the murderer must be someone else. Miss Green is innocent. So that's one example where truth and validity can fall together. Here's another example where they can come apart. All tigers are mammals. All mammals are carnivores. Therefore, all tigers are carnivores. Now again, same situation. If the premises were true, they would support the conclusion. And in fact, the conclusion is also true. So I don't think there are probably many vegetarian tigers out there, at least not if they have a choice about it, right? So here we have a situation where truth and validity come apart because one of the premises is not true, obviously. All mammals are carnivores. That one is the problematic one. So this argument is valid, but it is not sound. It has one false premise. And this shows basically that an argument can fail even if the conclusion is true or plausible. So that is one first way that is really going to trip a lot of people up. They kind of focus on the truth of a conclusion. In this case, it's obviously true. And then they fail when they're trying to independently evaluate the argument. That all clear? If something is not clear, just interrupt me. Okay. So let's toy with these examples a little more. So a lot can be gained by kind of turning the knobs on examples like this. So whoever the murderer is, they must be left-handed. Miss Green is left-handed, so she must be the murderer. So in this case, we have a situation where the premises do not support the conclusion. And again, this is really easy to see if you use this kind of image that we have here below. There's a group of left-handed people. Miss Green is one of them. That in itself is not going to be enough to say that she actually is the murderer. So in this case, this conclusion is not supported. It is not a valid argument. Additional things would be needed. We would need to say that perhaps she's the only left-handed person on Earth. Then the situation would be different, and so on and so forth. And the interesting thing to see about this is that this is going to be the case. So this is not going to be a valid argument, even if it turns out that Miss Green is the murderer. So even if that were the case, we would still not have a good reason for thinking that she was the murderer. We would need additional reasons for saying so. Okay? So that's another way where they can come apart. Here, finally, we have one example where truth and support are both provided. All birds lay eggs. Penguins are birds. Therefore, penguins lay eggs. The conclusion is supported. Premises and conclusions are also true. So this is sound. So this is perfectly okay. We can also look at this in a bit of a different way. So here's just a bit of a different way of visualizing this relationship. between validity, truth, and soundness. So this is an analogy. Let's say that a sound argument is going to be one where we have a situation where a light bulb is turned on. Two things have to be fulfilled, two switches have to be turned on, and they have to be appropriately connected to the light bulb. And we can see that if the switches are turned on and the connection is severed, nothing is going to happen. Again, fairly trivial and obvious. Both conditions have to be fulfilled for the light bulb to go on. So the analogy to arguments being if the premises have to be true, they have to support the conclusion, and if both things are fulfilled, then we have a sound argument. Strictly speaking, for the argument to be successful, and again we can see this in the light bulb case, if you have a light bulb going on in a situation where nobody's there to use it, it's going to be on but not very effective. If you turn one on in a room that's already illuminated, same thing will be true. So again, there can be additional factors that flow into success beyond the specific technical sense. Just for reasons of time, I'm going to skip this one. So one thing we've seen, now we've had a number of examples where we can say, so one of the Miss Green cases was like this, where she in fact turns out to be the murderer, for instance. We have seen so that when premises are true, they don't always support the conclusion. Now, could there be a case, we also had a case where one of the premises was false. But what about cases in which all of the premises are false? So is it possible to have an argument where all of the premises are false, but they still support the conclusion? So is this statement true? If all the premises in an argument are false, they cannot support the conclusion. So who says it's true? Just to raise your hands. Okay, who says it's false? So more people. Yeah. So false is correct. So premises can still support a conclusion, even if they're all false. So again, this aspect of support is going to be completely independent of the truth of the premises. We can see this with one example that hopefully will convince the people who opted for option A. So all Australians drink beer. Probably not true. There are probably some exceptions to the rule. Jenny, so me, is an Australian. This is also false. I'm not. Therefore, Jenny drinks beer. I do, every once in a while. So here we have a situation where we have a true conclusion to false premises. But they still turn out to support. If they were correct, they would support the conclusion. So these two things are independent. Is that clear? Yeah? Okay, good. So to briefly summarize that once more in a different manner, a sound argument has two factors, validity and truth. Those are two ingredients that have to come together, conditional aspect and a truth aspect. True premises can always fail to support a conclusion. The premises of an argument can support the conclusion even if they are false. And an argument can fail even if the conclusion is true, simply because it's not sound, not valid. So those are kind of things to keep in mind. And that completes our first introduction to evaluating arguments. Everything clear so far? Good. So now we can look at the two aspects that make soundness, that determine soundness of an argument in a bit more detail. So truth and support. And then we'll look at two types of support. So truth, how can we tell whether an argument is true? That's one of the main and first things that we're all interested in. And as I said at the beginning, the problem here is though there are some methods of trying to figure out whether the premises in an argument are true, there's no really foolproof method of doing this. So there's no way of really standardizing this. The appropriate way of deciding whether the premises are true is going to depend on the premises, is going to depend maybe even on the means that you have for checking them, and so on and so forth. So this is a trickier way to get at this. But nonetheless, we can look at some typical questions that you might want to ask, even though this list is not going to be exclusive in any way. So first question you can ask here: does the premise come from an expert authority or some other reliable resource? So this kind of relates to, again, what we were talking about earlier on, about the reliability and unreliability of sources. And this is a difficult one because immediately it comes with a warning sign. So if you're appealing to expert authority, you will want to have some good reasons as well for thinking that this person or this resource, this encyclopedia or something like that, this book, this journal, is actually one that you have good reasons for trusting. So you shouldn't confuse this with blind trust in any way. A doctor probably is a better expert, a better authority, for instance, if you want to know why you constantly have headaches than just Googling it, which tends to be notoriously unreliable, because if you Google reasons for headaches, you'll find out that your head is going to explode in 5 minutes or something like that. So that's one to be careful with. But it's also an important one, and it's one that we rely on necessarily every day. Is the premise beyond reasonable doubt? Is it common knowledge? So that's one that you can typically use in everyday contexts. It's also going to be one that you can typically use probably even in most areas of scientific discourse. Again, if you're sitting in a philosophy seminar on skepticism, appeals to common knowledge are not going to be appropriate. So again, this is not going to be completely context independent, but it's kind of a good first guideline. So common knowledge, common sense is kind of a first good way of deciding whether premises might be true. Does it contradict? Does any premise in the argument contradict something else you know to be true? Again, this would be, two contradictory things can't both be true at the same time, so this is a first good indicator that there might be something wrong with the premise. But things can also go otherwise. So the warning sign that this comes attached with is that, well, it could of course also turn out that that first belief that you had is also somehow, or is itself somehow flawed. So you'll have to be very careful in evaluating, or at least considering whether you might want to evaluate both of them and decide which, if any, of them is true. But contradiction is a first reason for thinking that there's something fishy going on here. If we have a generalization, so we often have this. Generally, we often have it in philosophy. Then we might want to ask, are there any counterexamples or exceptions? So a good strategy, and that's why generalizations are often weak and often tricky, is can you come up with any good counterexamples for it, any exceptions? It's always wrong to lie, except when, so on and so forth, and you insert your favorite example. Except when you're telling a white lie. Whatever, except when you're trying to avoid some greater catastrophe and so on. So that's where it gets interesting, and that's where it also gets problematic. But that's a good way to assess a premise. And here's another one, and this is going to be one that is fairly characteristic in science, so that you'll often find in scientific investigations, scientific theories or models. Let's say a premise offers an explanation of something. And that's where the argument comes from. That's why it's supposed to, or the way in which it is supposed to support the conclusion. Are there any alternative explanations on offer? And here the interesting thing is going to be not only whether there are alternative explanations, an outlandish explanation isn't going to, be very interesting, I guess, again, unless you're maybe looking at it in the context of, again, a very specialized philosophical discussion, for instance. But you're going to want to know whether there is a better explanation offered than the one offered in the premise. So many people would agree, and this is something you find in inference to the best explanation, for instance, or in philosophical pragmatism, that the best explanation of a fact is also the one that is the likeliest to be true. So you'll want to see whether there's a better one. If not, then there is reason for thinking the premise is true. So those are some ways that you can start out or try to assess the truth of your premises. What if you can't tell? What do you do then? You still continue to evaluate the argument. Well, yes, you can. So according to what we've been saying so far, and again, you might recall this point that we had in the tutorials as well, you can still bracket if you don't make any progress on the question of truth. You might also be presented with an argument that you just don't have the expertise on, or for some reason right now you don't have the means to check at all whether it is true. You might not have access to any additional information. You can still assess it. You can still accept the truth of a premise for the sake of argument and just think purely about the logical relationship or the connection it has to the conclusion. So just, again, to ask a conditional question. And that's going to be much of the work that we're going to be doing in this course as well. So in other words, truth is necessary, again, for soundness, but not for the ability to evaluate it as such. So you can also separate those two things in evaluating an argument. So that completes that second point about truth. Is so far everything clear? Yeah? So then we can look at support. What does it mean to actually support the conclusions in more detail? Again, this is something that we have already seen. So again, just to recap, we call an argument that satisfies this conditional claim that provides some support for the conclusion valid. And the other technical term that we're going to use here to contrast with validity is an argument that is invalid. An argument that is invalid does not support the conclusion. So those are just the two technical terms to keep in mind, and I'll come back to those in a second. So how do we test support? And here are three, and we'll see more later in the semester, but here are three first ways in which you can test for support independently, perhaps, of truth. So is there a possible situation? Can you think of any even conceivable situation in which all of the premises of an argument were true, but the conclusion were false? Now, if that were the case, there is no way that that could be a valid argument. If it is a valid argument, then it is ruled out that true premises could lead to a false conclusion. So if you can think of any possible situation, we'll have an example of that in a second, then it's not valid. It doesn't have support. Are there any facts, and this is a slightly different way of putting that, are there any facts or considerations that would count against the conclusion but be consistent with the premises? And again, this would be something that should be ruled out for a valid argument. So that's another way of looking at it. And finally, can you construct an analogous argument that is obviously invalid? So what you would be doing here is you would basically be abstracting from the content of the argument that you do have, and you would be presenting one that had exactly the analogous, exactly the same structure, but was obviously invalid. And if you can do this, this is an indication that the first one is invalid as well. So here are some examples of that. Here we have an example where premises are true, they don't support the conclusion, so it's an invalid argument. Everyone who lives in Melbourne lives in Victoria. Joan lives in Victoria, therefore Joan lives in Melbourne. Well, possibly she does. It's a possibility. However, the argument as it stands doesn't support that, because we can easily think of cases where this conclusion would be false, namely if she lives somewhere else. So this would not be a valid argument. This is the type of thing that can't be the case if it is a valid argument. Here's another one, a bit more tricky. Having the death penalty for serious crimes acts as a deterrent against committing those crimes. Since we want to reduce the number of serious crimes in our society, we should reintroduce the death penalty. So that's a strong statement. Might worry about the first premise. But if we assume that it is actually true, very well proven, very well established, that the death penalty does act as a deterrent against committing certain serious crimes, would that be enough to make us accept the conclusion? So is there anything you can think of that would be consistent with that first claim, but would still count against the conclusion? If yes, then this is not a valid argument. So can you think of anything? Or does this force you, if you accept that the first sentence is true, does this force you to believe the conclusion? We should reintroduce the death penalty.
You could say having the death penalty lessens the value of life, so we shouldn't reintroduce it to society.
So you could introduce something like a general principle. It might be that having the death penalty does reduce the number of crimes, but it doesn't matter, because we should never, under any conditions, kill people. It's just wrong. It's ethically wrong. Or maybe it does something to us as a society that we don't want. So there might be an independent reason for rejecting that. Any other types of ways? So that would be kind of a, yeah.
Does this tie into the second point you made on the previous slide, which is facts and considerations that count against the conclusion itself, that the premises are true? So I could argue in this circumstance that the death penalty is not the best way to stop serious crimes, but in actual fact, something else can do the exact same thing. So even if premise 1 is true and premise 2 is true, my new conclusion can still be sound as a result, even though I'm not using the death penalty.
Right. So you can still, well, in that case, the argument as such wouldn't be sound, right? It wouldn't be valid. We wouldn't be saying that the fact that the death penalty prevents or brings down the number of serious crimes in itself justifies the reintroduction of the death penalty. So that would just, again, be a different way of using it. But exactly, you could introduce a different argument and say, look, I'm not so worried about general principles, as you said, whether we can ever be justified in killing somebody, as we would in the death penalty. But just as a matter of fact, there are other means that work equally well and that are less problematic, less worrisome from an ethical perspective, or perhaps there are other means that work even better. So that's kind of similar to finding not a better explanation in this case, but a better way of bringing the same outcome about. So in that case, we should clearly choose the other one. So exactly, so you would start constructing another argument in that manner. Yes?
This example, you couldn't argue that it would be a sound argument based on the conclusion. Is that what you're saying?
The new argument or the one that we have here?
Because, for example, someone with a different opinion might agree with that claim.
Good. There are two good things, important things in there. Yeah.
Does the strength of the support change the soundness of an argument?
Well, what is, yeah.
So I wouldn't say this has very strong support for the conclusion, but I would still say that argument is sound because it's true, valid, and it
Well, we had said that soundness is a product basically of validity and truth. And we had also, yeah?
So would you then, taking your point, have to provide either expert opinion or statistics to support that for it to be really a sound argument?
I would say it's sound regardless of how much support it had.
Yeah, like technically, if you take the steps of constructing a sound argument, like I would argue that that would be a sound argument, technically.
So there can be disagreement on whether something is or is not sound, but what we're going to see, so validity itself is a bit more difficult, again, than what I've been presenting, and we'll come to that. But one thing that we had said is that if we have any cases where you can construct an analogous or alternative argument that lead, for instance, to a false, where true premises lead to a false conclusion and so on and so forth, that counts against saying that we have support or that we have validity. And if we don't have validity, we don't have soundness. So there are different ways in which that can be the case that I'll get to in a second, but we wouldn't then say that. So if we have a situation like this, where we don't feel that we're forced, we have a true premise, we're assuming that, but we're not forced to accept the conclusion. That means there's something fishy about it. It's not valid and hence not sound. Yeah? Oh. So a bit more about that in a second. So just to give an example, yeah?
I'm sorry. So are you saying that is not a sound argument?
Yeah, because we can think of a way in which we're not forced from a true premise to accept the conclusion. There are other reasons, other things we could do. So that is saying, no, it doesn't follow that we should, this premise does not entail that we should reintroduce the death penalty. Doesn't work. It is an argument. It does offer reasons for believing the conclusion, but it doesn't work, as we saw. So that...
So the truth aspect.
Yes. So also the support aspect. There are other reasons, other things we could do to prevent serious crime that might work better. If we assume that we have them, then the conclusion doesn't follow. So let's just look at one example of the third way of assessing whether we have support or whether an argument is valid. Lions are carnivores. Sheep are not lions. Therefore, sheep are not carnivores. Can you think of any way of constructing a really similar argument that is obviously not valid? If you can, then this first one is fishy as well. So just think about replacing, one of the words. You can even just, turning the knobs on this one is going to be very simple. So any intuitions? Yeah. Mm-hmm. Or many of them are, yeah. So I think some were vegetarians. But yeah, dinosaurs would be good. Tigers would work, right? Therefore, tigers are not carnivores. Same structure, just a slightly different content, obviously, just flawed. So that shows you that the first one doesn't work as well. Equally for the women are human beings and so on and so forth argument. Just doesn't work. It can still be invalid in other words if it has a true conclusion. So to summarize that, and then we'll quickly move to the last point, we say that an argument is valid if it is truth-preserving. If its premises are true, then this truth carries on naturally to the conclusion, and things could not be otherwise. An argument is invalid if it is not truth-preserving. Even if the premises are true, the truth of its conclusion is not guaranteed. So this truth will not automatically, in virtue of its structure, carry on to the conclusion. The validity of an argument is going to depend only on its structure. Whether it is sound additionally depends on truth, so it depends on content. So insofar as we're talking about validity, and support, we're really only talking about the structure. That's why we can make those replacements, replace sheep with dinosaurs or tigers, for instance, and assess the validity, because it has nothing to do with content as such. And that's also why we can have general rules for assessing this. So let's move on to the last point. And we're going to look at two kinds of validity, two ways in which an argument can be valid. And the first of these is, again, a technical term. It's deductive validity. So this is something that philosophers get very excited about. Deduction is the most certain kind, the most safe way of supporting a conclusion. For some and this is true for arguments where it's literally impossible in the strongest sense for the premises to be true and the conclusion false. We've seen several examples of this today. I'm not going to read them out again. Here is one. Let's say it's absolutely, indubitably true. All Germans drink beer. There is no exception to this rule. Jenny is a German. That's also true. Therefore, Jenny drinks beer. Also true. Every once in a while I do. And given these premises and given their truth, it is absolutely inconceivable, impossible that I don't drink beer. Arguments of this type are deductively valid. So a deductively valid argument is one for which it is impossible for the premises to be true and the conclusion to be false. This is the strongest possible kind of support we can have for a conclusion. And we might even say that the premises here logically entail the conclusion, just as a bit of technical terminology in the background. So this is the strongest way in which an argument can be valid. And some people will only use validity to describe deductive validity. We won't, but this is really the strongest way in which it can be valid. And then there are inductively valid arguments that work slightly differently. And this kind of brings us back to a bit of the confusion that we had earlier on. So does a valid argument allow for any wiggle room? Is there any conceivable way in which a valid argument could lead from true premises to a false conclusion and still be valid? Yes, there is, namely for inductively valid arguments. Here we will say an argument is going to be inductively valid if it provides very good reasons for thinking that the conclusion is true. To say this, it's not the case that the conclusion is necessarily true, but we will want to say that if the premises are true, the conclusion very likely is also true. So here we've moved from necessary truth to highly probable truth. And you can immediately see that a lot of the cases that we are interested in, scientific truths, for instance, are going to be of this inductively valid sort, are going to be supported by inductively valid arguments. And here's an important difference between them. So inductive validity is not an all or nothing affair. It's not yes or no. It's a matter of degree. Something can be more or less inductively valid. So and that's where it immediately gets interesting, and that's where it immediately gets difficult and murky. So that's where we have room for debate. Well, are there really better ways of bringing down serious crime rates than the death penalty? We immediately get bogged down in difficult discussions. So there can be weaker or stronger forms of inductive validity, depending on the data that you're talking about. I'm just going to give you two more examples of this and then wrap this up. So look at these two, and these two types of validity, and again, we'll come back to this a lot. This is just kind of to have this in your toolkit as two basic important terms. Inductive and deductive validity can be hard to tell apart. So almost all elephants like chocolate. This is an elephant, therefore this elephant likes chocolate, is inductively valid. It's very probable that he does. If you say all elephants like chocolate, that does not logically allow for there to be any exceptions. It is impossible that this specific elephant does not like chocolate. Just can't happen. That's deductive validity. So this is an issue of really looking at the exact way in which something is formulated. Last question for you guys. The sun rises every day. Tomorrow is a day. Seems fairly convincing. Therefore, the sun will rise tomorrow. Is that inductively or deductively valid? What kind of validity do we have here? Is there any conceivable way in which that could be false? Yeah.
So I think premise 1 is inductively valid by itself. The conclusion is deductively valid if we assume that the sun rises every day. I'm sure there's some sort of inductive validity in the premises there.
Okay, so an inductive validity, the way we use it, will be a property of an argument. Not yes? So,
There are parts of the world where the sun doesn't rise every day. So like if you're at the north or south pole, the sun doesn't rise every day. So therefore, it could be like one of the premises isn't necessarily true.
so we could try to find counterexamples, yeah.
Wouldn't this be a deductively valid argument due to the fact that it doesn't leave any wriggle room for truth factors? So it's either absolutely true or it isn't true at all.
Tricky, isn't it?
Argument.
Tricky, isn't it? So the question is going to be, I mean, we all clearly assume it's true. Of course it's going to rise tomorrow. There's no question about it. And the question is exactly, is there any room for doubt? What you would be saying if you were saying it was deductively valid was that, and this is an old philosophical example that many people have debated about, what you would be saying that for it to be deductively valid, we would have to know beyond the shadow of a doubt on all days that there ever have been and ever will be, the sun rises. We can't know that. Yeah. So, yes, absolute. No wiggle room whatsoever. So this is inductively valid. It has extremely strong inductive support, but it's not 100%, so it's inductive. Okay, that pretty much brings us to the end of today's lecture. So an inductively valid argument will be very likely truth-preserving, but not guaranteed. Next week, we'll look a little bit about ways in which we can fail to have support for an argument. We'll look at different standard deductively valid forms. And because of the time, we're going to push the philosophical argument of the week into the tutorials, and I'll give it to you then. And I'll just put it up while you pack. And with that, I thank you for your attention. And we'll look at this later on this afternoon.
With the sun argument, it rises every day, so it will rise tomorrow. Is that a sound argument?
Why wouldn't it be?
Because the premises don't force us to accept the conclusion.
Well,
because there's that slight bit of doubt in everything that is inductively valid. So I'm just wondering, are all inductive arguments not sound?
So, no. So that's a good question. I mean, you would say it was sound because it does have this inductive type of validity, and that would be enough in that case for that type of sound.
At what level is the inductive validity? Do you stop calling something sound? Like with the murder case, you said that wasn't sound because it didn't have enough inductive validity, and I was just wondering, is there a line somewhere, or is it arbitrary, or?
See, that's where it gets difficult and interesting, because what the question to ask would be whether you would have a cutoff line for saying something was inductively valid or not.
Yeah.
And it's going to depend, I mean, we probably will want something that's better than 50%. It's going to depend on a lot of factors. How willing are you to take the risk? How important is it? How big is the damage going to be? So that immediately